Good day. Now, at this juncture, we will be talking about your adrenal glands. So, your adrenal glands are located on top or above the upper pole of the kidneys. So, it is attached to the upper pole of the kidneys. That's why it's also known as your suprarenal glands. So, suprarenal because it's attached to the upper portion or the upper pole of your kidneys. So, in short, it's located superior to your kidneys. So, this is one of your kidneys, and this is your adrenal gland. So, it's located superiorly and medially to the kidneys in your retroperitoneal space. So, that's why it's called as the suprarenal glands. And also, the adult adrenal glands are shaped like pyramids. So it's shaped like pyramids. So it's pyramidal in structure. And also, it weighs about 4 to 6 grams. And the weight of your adrenal gland, so this feature, the weight, so by weight, they have the highest perfusion of blood per gram of tissue. So that feature of your adrenal glands ensures that there is a rapid dissemination of hormones throughout the body in response to stress. Okay, and also your adrenal glands consist of the cortex and the medulla. And on gross sectioning, both regions remain distinct. So the cortex appear yellow. So this one, the cortex, appears yellow, and also the medulla appears as dark mahogany. So that's the colors. As what you can see here, this is your cortex. So that is yellowish or yellow. And this is the medulla. So that is described in gross sectioning as dark mahogany. And also, this cortex makes up about 80 to 90% of your adrenal gland. And also, another thing that you have to remember is that the medulla, so the medulla, that is of neural crest origin. So this one, so neural crest origin. So this is your ectoderm. So neural crest origin or ectoderm, and this medulla stores and secretes your catecholamines. However, your cortex, it's of mesenchymal origin. So this one, so mesenchymal. That's for your cortex. And also, you have to take note that these glands have a very rich arterial supply that forms a subcapsular plexus, and also it empties into a central vein. So again, these adrenal glands are on top of your kidneys, and they are very distinct in terms of weight because that features ensure that there is a rapid dissemination or distribution of hormones throughout the body in response to our stress. So in this discussion, I will primarily focus on the function of your adrenal cortex. So this one. Now, if we take a look at the structure of the adrenal glands, we can see that they are composed of distinct but conjoined glands. Distinct because the cortex is distinct from the medulla, but they are conjoined because we have the outer adrenal cortex, so which makes up about, again, 80 to 90%, and the inner medulla, which contributes to 10% of the total adrenal weight. So they are distinct but conjoined glands. And another one is that the cortex, so this one, so the outer gland is composed of how many layers or how many zones? So it is composed of 3 zones. So it's zona glomerulosa, we also have zona fasciculata, and zona reticularis. So we have zona glomerulosa, fasciculata, and reticularis. And before we discuss that one, let's have first the 3 major hormones in the cortex. So again, we have the major cortex hormones. So Number one, we have, of course, the aldosterone. So I know you already know or familiar with the functions of this aldosterone. Number two, we have cortisol. And number three, we have this DHEAS. So this is the main adrenal androgen. So the DHEAS, what's the meaning of that one? So that is dihydroepiandrosterone sulfate. So again, that is dihydroepiandrosterone sulfate. So that's for one of the major hormones of the cortex. So let's have first the zona glomerulosa. So the cells of zona glomerulosa, or the G zone or the outermost zones, are the only ones in the adrenal gland which are capable of secreting or producing large amounts of aldosterone. This one. So again, the zona glomerulosa synthesizes mineralocorticoids, particularly the major mineralocorticoid, which is your aldosterone. Again, what's the function of aldosterone? So this one helps in sodium reabsorption, and another one, potassium excretion. So I hope you still remember the function of your aldosterone. Another one, why do you think the zona glomerulosa is the only one that can produce aldosterone? So that's because your zona glomerulosa is the only one that contains aldosterone synthase. This one. So aldosterone synthase. So this enzyme is necessary for the synthesis of aldosterone. So that's why it could produce a large amount of aldosterone. How about the next one? The zona fasciculata, or the F zone, or the middle zone. So this zona fasciculata, the cells in this zone or layer, can also generate androgen precursors such as what I have mentioned, the dihydroepiandrosterone sulfate, and that DHEAS, so this one, it is sulfated not on the fasciculata layer but on the reticularis layer. Again, the DHEA is sulfated in the reticularis or R zone. And again, that reticularis is the innermost zone, so it makes up about 15%. So it will sulfate the DHEA, so this one, to DHEAS. So that's again dihydroepiandrosterone sulfate. Okay, again, that's the main adrenal androgen. So you have to take note here, GFR. So the zona glomerulosa is capable of producing aldosterone, which balances, of course, the salt levels in the body. Whereas the zona fasciculata is responsible for producing glucocorticoids, which is, of course, responsible for balancing the sugar level of the body with the help of your cortisol. And lastly, the zona reticularis, of course, is mainly responsible in balancing the different sex hormones. So we have the salt, sugar, and sex. So GFR, salt, sugar, and sex for your mnemonics. Now this one shows the illustration of the different layers of the adrenal cortex. So the zona glomerulosa, zona fasciculata, and zona reticularis. So you have to remember that each zone produces hormones, and the hormones produced by the adrenal cortex are referred to as the corticosteroids. So it's again corticosteroids. And we have for the zona glomerulosa as the mineralocorticoids, again for the aldosterone. For the zona fasciculata, again, we have the glucocorticoids, particularly the cortisol. And also for zona reticularis, aside from the DHEAS, we also have estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone. And how about your adrenal medulla? So this one is mainly responsible for producing the norepinephrine and epinephrine. And also, I failed to mention this earlier, that the hormones of the adrenal cortex are steroid derivatives. That's why they are considered as steroid hormones, because they are synthesized primarily from low-density lipoproteins. So you will know that later as we go along with our discussion. So again, we have the three major classes of steroid hormones. So they are again produced in the adrenal cortex. So number one are your mineralocorticoids. So again, they are responsible for fluid and electrolyte balance of the body. Next one, we have the glucocorticoids, which regulate glucose production and also protein metabolism. And also, we have the sex steroids that regulate sexual development, and they also control many aspects of pregnancy. So you will know that as we go along with our discussion. And also, these adrenocortical hormones are bound to plasma proteins. And the three proteins that I'm telling you is number one, the albumin. Of course, this is very familiar with you. Number two, we also have the transcortin. So transcortin. And lastly, we have the CBG, the cortisol binding globulin. So those are the proteins that bind your steroid hormones. Now first, let us have the mineralocorticoids. So these mineralocorticoids have gained this name, so these mineralocorticoids, because they especially affect the electrolytes or the minerals of the extracellular fluids. So primarily the sodium and the potassium. So owing to the function of your aldosterone in sodium reabsorption and potassium excretion. And another one, what is again the major mineralocorticoid? So that's the aldosterone that is synthesized primarily by the adrenal cortex, particularly of what zone? So it's the zona glomerulosa, because again, this zone is the only one that contains aldosterone synthase. And another thing is that approximately 30% of the total aldosterone in the plasma circulates bound to cortisol binding globulin, or the CBG, and around 42% is interacting with the albumin. So this is the structure of the aldosterone. And again, the main function of this aldosterone is it promotes renal tubular reabsorption of what? Okay, sodium. And of course, the secretion or excretion of potassium. And the half-life of aldosterone is 15 to 20 minutes. And take note, this one, it's inactivated in the liver. So once inactivated, there is a formation of tetrahydroaldosterone. And I know you are very familiar with this one. So this aldosterone, is regulated by renin-angiotensin system, or the renin-angiotensin aldosterone system, RAAS. So just a little review of what is happening in the renin-angiotensin system is that when the kidneys sense that there is a decreased blood pressure, or let's say a decreased sodium level, so what will happen is that there will be a release of renin from the JGA, or the juxtaglomerular apparatus of the kidney. And once this renin is produced from the JGA, this renin now will convert your angiotensinogen to angiotensin 1. So this angiotensinogen coming from the liver, again, will be converted to angiotensin 1. So this angiotensin 1 will be converted to the active form. Take note, this is still inactive, so it's like it's still sleeping. So in order to use that one, you have to wake it up. You have to activate that one. So it will be activated or converted to angiotensin 2 by an enzyme we call as ACE. So that's coming from the lungs. So this ACE converts angiotensin 1 to angiotensin 2. And what will happen next is that once angiotensin 2 is produced, it will cause vasoconstriction, resulting in increased blood pressure, and also it will stimulate the adrenal glands. So this is just one of the main functions of the angiotensin 2. So it will stimulate the adrenal glands, particularly the adrenal cortex, the zona glomerulosa, to release or to produce aldosterone. And now aldosterone will reabsorb sodium, and together with that is also the reabsorption of water. So now the blood volume increases and also the blood pressure is regulated. Now, how about for glucocorticoids? So this one, they have gained their name because they exhibit important effects that increase blood glucose concentration. So it reflects the blood glucose level. That's why it's glucocorticoids. And aside from that one, they also have additional effects on both proteins and fat metabolism that are also equally as important to body functions as their effects on carbohydrate or glucose metabolism. And for glucocorticoids, we have first the cortisol. So this is most significant physiologically, and we also have the cortisone. And this cortisol, this is known as the stress hormones. So that means it is increased in cases of stress, and also it is otherwise known as hydrocortisone. So those are just the other names of cortisol. So approximately 83% is bound to CBG or cortisol binding globulin, 12% to albumin, and 5% as in free state. And next one, this cortisol, what is the function of this one? So, as stated in here, it decreases glucose utilization by cells. Remember, cortisol increases blood sugar level. So, that means it could increase the blood sugar level because it decreases the cellular uptake. So, I hope you can still remember this one. And another one is it helps to maintain blood glucose concentration by increasing this process, gluconeogenesis. So that means the proteins, the fats, the amino acids are being converted to glucose. So that's gluconeogenesis. So in short, this cortisol blocks the uptake of glucose into the tissues or into the cells, and of course except to our CNS or central nervous system, because our CNS needs, of course, glucose. So another one, to make it simple, the main function of your cortisol is it enhances the glucose production from proteins and amino acids. So that's again gluconeogenesis. And aside from that one, it contributes the maintenance of blood pressure by augmenting the constrictive effects of catecholamines on blood levels. And also, it activates anti-stress and anti-inflammatory pathway. So you have to take note of this one. At a cellular level, these glucocorticoids may inhibit the production and also the action of anti-inflammatory pathways such as the cytokines. So are you familiar with this one, cytokines? So these cytokines are cell signaling molecules that aid the cells, or it aids the cell-to-cell communication in immune response, and also it stimulates the movement of cells towards the site of inflammation or towards the site of infection or whenever there is trauma. So at a cellular level, the glucocorticoids can inhibit the production of this cytokine. So in short, if cortisol is present, cytokine is inhibited. However, also, there are cases in which the immune system must be suppressed. So the function of the immune system can be reduced by the help of glucocorticoids, particularly this cortisol. So that is particularly useful for preventing graft rejection, or in cases that there is transplant. So it prevents transplant rejection, and also for treating allergic or autoimmune diseases. So like for example, in lupus erythematosus, or for example, in rheumatoid arthritis. So cortisol is helpful in this one. So again, LE and RA. So lupus erythematosus and rheumatoid arthritis. And also, this glucocorticoids, this cortisol, can be used also in treating the patients. So again, this will suppress the immune system. Okay, take note of this one. So these glucocorticoids, particularly this cortisol, should not be used in patients with infectious diseases because again, immunosuppressive and anti-inflammatory actions may allow the infection to spread because again, it goes back to the function of cortisol that is inhibitory to these cytokines. Another one. So cortisol has a diurnal rhythm. So the peak of cortisol production is in the morning. So usually 8 to 9 a.m. and the trough values are seen at approximately 10 to 11 p.m. So highest 8 to 9 and lowest 10 to 11 p.m. So the absence of the diurnal rhythm can be an important diagnostic clue. So in this reason, for example, laboratory request for plasma cortisol or plasma assay or plasma test should include also the evaluation of both morning and late evening samples, of course, to document the presence or the absence of the cyclic production of this hormone, this cortisol. Okay, and also the patients who are undergoing significant stress, they might lose the rhythmic production and they might exhibit elevated cortisol levels with no discernible cycle of synthesis. So that's how the diurnal rhythm of cortisol is important to us. Now, one of the things that we have to consider in order for us to understand the function and also the regulation of this hormone, this cortisol, is to understand the feedback mechanism of this cortisol. So this image will show us the hormonal regulation of cortisol biosynthesis. So remember, we have 3 different glands here that are interconnected and they work hand in hand in order to maintain the cortisol level in our body. And as a result, the blood sugar levels in our body and also the proteins and fat metabolism are all regulated. So they are the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, and adrenal gland. So take note that this hypothalamus produces the CRH or the corticotropin releasing hormone, this one. So let me just write that one. So corticotropin releasing hormone. So again, that is released from your hypothalamus. Whereas your pituitary gland, this one, this produces the ACTH. That one, it's the adrenocorticotropic hormone. So adrenocorticotropic hormone. And lastly, you have here your adrenal glands. So again, the adrenal glands, particularly the adrenal cortex, and to be specific, the zona fasciculata is the one that produces your cortisol. Okay? So again, the hypothalamus releases the CRH, the pituitary gland releases the ACTH, and the adrenal gland is the one that produces your cortisol. And another thing, particularly, it's the anterior pituitary gland that releases your adrenocorticotropic hormone. So that anterior pituitary gland is also known as your adenohypophysis. Okay, because the posterior pituitary gland is the neurohypophysis. So it's the anterior pituitary gland or the adenohypophysis which releases the ACTH. So in order to illustrate that one, so for example, you have here your hypothalamus. Also, the hypothalamus is connected towards your pituitary gland. So this one, so this is your pituitary gland. So that one, that is the pituitary gland. So this is the anterior pituitary gland, and this one, it's the posterior pituitary gland. This one, this is the hypothalamus. Of course, your adrenal gland is produced, or I mean, is located on top of your kidney. So this one, so this is your adrenal glands. So it's important to know the feedback mechanism of these different glands and the hormones that they produce, because if there are cases wherein the patient is experiencing adrenal insufficiency, then sometimes the doctor would ask or would want to know where is really the cause of that adrenal insufficiency. So for example, if the patient has a decreased cortisol level, so probably the problem is really in the adrenal gland. Or sometimes the patient is experiencing low cortisol level because the pituitary gland is not releasing ACTH. So the low ACTH is causing a decrease in cortisol level, because again, as what I have said, the hypothalamus, pituitary gland, and adrenal glands are all interrelated and interconnected. So again, for example, if the patient has adrenal insufficiency, so that means the adrenal gland might not be producing the cortisol, so this one, particularly the adrenal cortex, or again, it may be because of the tumors that are located near the pituitary gland or in the pituitary gland that decreases the ACTH production and could result to a decreased cortisol level. So we have three causes or three conditions wherein it could cause adrenal insufficiency. So we have primary adrenal insufficiency, secondary adrenal insufficiency, or tertiary adrenal insufficiency. So how would we differentiate the three conditions? So first, again, we have the primary adrenal insufficiency. So where do you think is the problem of this primary adrenal insufficiency? So primary, so you have to remember that cortisol is primarily produced from the adrenal cortex, from the adrenal gland. So when we talk about primary adrenal insufficiency, the problem is in the adrenal gland. So primary. Whereas when we say secondary adrenal insufficiency, the problem lies in the pituitary gland, in the anterior pituitary gland. So that's secondary adrenal insufficiency. And when we say tertiary adrenal insufficiency, tertiary AI, so the problem is in the hypothalamus. So just remember, primary, the cortisol is primarily produced from the adrenal glands. Okay, so in cases wherein there is a decreased cortisol level because of the problems in the adrenal gland, then that is primary adrenal insufficiency. So what would we expect on the levels of the different hormones? So of course, if there is primary adrenal insufficiency, we can see that the cortisol is decreased, right? Because the adrenal glands can't produce cortisol. The adrenal cortex has a problem. So how would the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland react? So because of this decreased cortisol, the feedback mechanism will follow that the hypothalamus will produce more CRH. So why will the hypothalamus increase the production of CRH? Because the adrenal glands send signal to the hypothalamus that it needs production of cortisol, because again, there is a defect. So there is a decreased cortisol. So hypothalamus will increase the CRH production. How about the anterior pituitary gland? So because there is an increased production of CRH from the hypothalamus, then it follows that this CRH will stimulate the adenohypophysis to produce this adrenocorticotropic hormone. So in primary adrenal insufficiency, we can see that there is an increased CRH and increased ACTH. But again, the cortisol is decreased because primarily the problem is in the adrenal cortex. How about in the secondary AI? So in secondary AI, so meaning to say there are conditions or like tumors or other diseases that affect the pituitary gland. So because the pituitary gland is affected, then it follows that the ACTH production from this gland is also affected. So in secondary AI, so we would expect that there is a decreased ACTH. Remember, this is adrenal insufficiency. Okay? So because there is a decreased ACTH in secondary AI, what will now be the level of the cortisol? So can the pituitary gland stimulate the adrenal gland to produce cortisol? Because it has a problem here. So what will happen is that because there is a decreased ACTH, it cannot send signal to the adrenal glands to produce cortisol. So what will happen to the cortisol level of the secondary AI? So there is a decreased cortisol production. And take note, there is a decreased cortisol production from this adrenal gland. So that will send a feedback to the hypothalamus to increase the production of the CRH. So that means in secondary AI, there is an increased production of CRH. Because again, the problem is in the pituitary gland, in the anterior pituitary gland. So it will also affect the adrenal gland. But the hypothalamus is okay. So it can still produce CRH. But even if the hypothalamus would produce CRH and would stimulate the anterior pituitary gland, there is a problem in here. So still, the production of ACTH is affected. And also, it would affect the production of cortisol from the adrenal gland. Okay? How about in the tertiary AI? So in the tertiary AI, what is affected? It's the hypothalamus. So what do you think will happen? So in the tertiary AI, the CRH is decreased. So again, they are interconnected. So it would follow that there will be a decreased ACTH production from the adenohypophysis, and of course, it would follow that there would be a decreased production of cortisol level. So that's how the doctor would correlate the results of the patient, of course, to the conditions and the values of the hormones involved in this regulation or feedback mechanism of cortisol. So I hope you understand this one. So another important thing that you have to take note is that the hormones of the adrenal cortex are referred to as steroid hormones. I think I have mentioned this earlier. So they are referred to as steroid hormones because they are derived from steroids, or they are steroid derivatives synthesized primarily from the LDL cholesterol. So all adrenal steroids are derived by sequential enzymatic conversion of a common substrate, cholesterol. So as what I have said, sequential enzymatic conversion. So that involves enzymes. So what is happening is we can still see the feedback mechanism as what I have discussed earlier. So the corticotropin releasing hormone is secreted from the hypothalamus in response to serum cortisol level, in response to circadian signals, or sometimes because of stress. So once the CRH is released from the hypothalamus, it would cause the release of stored ACTH from the adenohypophysis, from the anterior pituitary gland, which in turn will stimulate the adrenal gland. So it would stimulate the transport of free cholesterol into the adrenal mitochondria. That would now initiate the steroid production. So you have to remember that it's only the free cholesterol that can enter the steroidogenic pathway in response to ACTH. So let me write that one. So it's the free cholesterol again that can enter the steroidogenic pathway in response to this ACTH production. And what will happen is that the adrenal parenchymal cells will accumulate and store circulating low-density lipoprotein. So that is already happening in the adrenal gland. And what will happen is that we have this star. So we call it a star. So the acronym, so this one. So the T is small because it refers to steroid acute regulatory protein. So that's STAR. So what is the function of this STAR? So this STAR will shuttle or will deliver the LDL across the mitochondrial membrane, where it begins its journey down the steroidogenic pathway. So that is steroidogenic pathway, or what we call as the steroidogenesis. So steroidogenesis refers to the production of steroid hormones. And also take note of this one, this pregnenolone. So once the STAR shuttles the free cholesterol to the mitochondrial cells, it will now be converted to pregnenolone. And take note of this one, the conversion of cholesterol to pregnenolone is a rate-limiting step in steroid biosynthesis. So in this case, there are 6 carbons that are removed from the cholesterol by what enzyme? Okay? By the cytochrome P450. So cytochrome P450 enzyme. So that's the mitochondrial membrane cytochrome P450 enzyme. So again, the conversion of cholesterol to pregnenolone is a rate-limiting step in steroidogenesis, or in the synthesis of steroid, wherein 6 carbons are removed from cholesterol by this cytochrome P450. Now, what you're seeing here is the steroidogenic pathways of the adrenal cortex. And remember, the adrenal steroid hormones are categorized according to mineralocorticoid, glucocorticoid, and androgens. So they are respectively produced from glomerulosa, fasciculata, and reticularis. So this is producing the salt of the body, this one sugar, and of course this one sex hormones. So the glomerulosa, it's the outermost layer, this one the middle layer, and the reticularis, it's the innermost layer. That's why they often say the deeper it goes, the sweeter it gets. That's just to help you remember the different layers of the adrenal cortex and also the substances produced by them. So salt, sugar, and sex hormones. And also, as what I have mentioned, the steroidogenic pathways involve enzymes. And the enzymes that catalyze these synthetic reactions here, as what you can see in the illustration, are of 4 general types. So we have the hydroxylases. We also have the dehydrogenases. Also, the desmolases. And lastly, the isomerases. So take note also that most of the inborn errors of metabolism affecting the steroid hormone synthesis in the adrenal cortex involved the deficiencies of hydroxylases. That's why these hydroxylases constitute the most clinically important group of enzymes when we are talking about the steroidogenesis or the steroidogenic pathway. Okay, now let's take a look at this zona glomerulosa. So the chief mineralocorticoid of this layer is the aldosterone. So this aldosterone promotes the reabsorption of sodium and the excretion of potassium. And also together, it's the reabsorption of water by the kidneys to help maintain blood pressure. So what you can see here, and of course, our tonicity. And take note also this enzyme, the aldosterone synthase. So other references would call it as aldosterone synthetase. So this is otherwise known as CYP11 B2 enzyme. So the expression of this enzyme within the zona glomerulosa is site-specific. And because it is site-specific, as a result, the synthesis of aldosterone, so the synthesis of aldosterone and its intermediary 18-hydroxylated metabolites, so this one, so 18-hydroxylated metabolites is restricted to the zona glomerulosa. Okay? And the precursor molecules to aldosterone, this one, the DOC, that's the 11-deoxycorticosterone, and also the 11-deoxycortisol. So they possess mineralocorticoid activity. However, unlike aldosterone, so they can be synthesized within the zona fasciculata as well as in the zona glomerulosa. So that explains now the hypertension and the electrolyte disturbances seen in some forms of congenital adrenal hyperplasia. And also take note of this one. Remember that aldosterone, although it is a mineralocorticoid, it will still respond to acute changes in ACTH, just like your cortisol. So aldosterone will still respond to ACTH production by the anterior pituitary gland. However, this aldosterone, okay, the production of this aldosterone is mainly regulated by what system? Okay, by renin-angiotensin aldosterone system. So this aldosterone can respond to ACTH, but it's mainly under the control of RAAS. So take note of that one. Also, we have the zona fasciculata. So this makes up the 75% of the cortex, right? And also, this fasciculata is responsible for the synthesis and secretion of glucocorticoids, and to a lesser extent, of course, of the androgens and estrogens. And the main glucocorticoid produced from the zona fasciculata is, of course, the cortisol. And this cortisol, again, is needed in times of stress to maintain blood pressure and also the blood sugar level, right? And also to prevent shock. And although this cortisol, this one, is the most important glucocorticoid, you have to take note also that the corticosterone, which is a hormone of the mineralocorticoid pathway, so this one, the corticosterone, okay, that's a hormone of the mineralocorticoid pathway, as seen here in the glomerulosa. Okay, this hormone also possesses glucocorticoid activity. Again, let me just repeat what I have said, that although cortisol is the most important glucocorticoid, the corticosterone, which is a mineralocorticoid hormone, also possesses glucocorticoid activity, just like your cortisol. Okay, next one, the zona reticularis. Of course, that produces your sex hormones, the androgens and the estrogens are produced in here. And also take note that the androgens, okay, are 18-carbon steroids. Okay, and they also have saturated A rings in contrast to the estrogens. Okay, so again, let me just write that one. So the androgens, okay, they are 18-carbon steroid and they are having saturated A rings, whereas the estrogen, okay, they are 17-carbon steroid and they have unsaturated A rings. So androgens, 18-carbon steroid and saturated A rings. Okay? Whereas this estrogen, 17 carbons and then unsaturated A rings. So now what you can see here is another illustration of steroidogenic pathway, but this one it's more detailed because it's also color-coded, and also the structure of each steroid hormones are shown here or is illustrated. So when we say steroidogenesis, so this one, steroidogenesis is the process or pathway by which some cells can manufacture steroids such as aldosterone, cortisol, estradiol, and also testosterone, and other steroid hormones, of course, from the parent steroid, which is this cholesterol. And take note that cholesterol has a lot of functions. So that includes stabilization of the cell membrane and the production of bile acid. So I guess I have mentioned this in the blood chemistry. But take note that one of the most important functions of cholesterol is its conversion into these steroid hormones. And in this illustration, it's color-coded for us maybe to easily remember the different steroid hormones. So for the yellow ones, okay, shaded yellow here are progestogens. The blue one, they are masculinizing hormones, so they are androgens. For the pink ones, they are estrogens, so they are feminizing hormones. For the green ones, they are glucocorticoids or corticosteroids. And of course, for the purple ones here, they are mineralocorticoids, particularly this aldosterone. And also, aside from the color coding of the different hormones, the enzymes are also categorized in different cellular compartments based on their color. So the color red here, so there are 3 of them. So the color red, those are mitochondrial enzymes. And the green ones here, most of them are green, so they are microsomal enzymes. So meaning they are embedded in the membrane of the smooth endoplasmic reticulum. So now let's take a look at the pathway. So here's our parent structure, of course, the cholesterol. Okay, and pay attention also to the numbering system because some of these enzymes are going to be named based on the numbering system of cholesterol. So notice that that structure is numbered. For example, they are going to act on a certain carbon atoms or hydroxyl groups. And any of these enzymes that have a number beside them, such as this one, the 21 hydroxylase. So this number beside this enzyme gives us an indication or an idea of which atom it's acting on. So that's why I'm telling you that you have to pay attention to the numbering system of the cholesterol. So first, the tail of cholesterol. Okay, I will refer it as a tail for the layman's term. So the tail of cholesterol beginning at carbon 22 through carbon 27. So how many of them? So there are 6 of them, right? And as what I have mentioned earlier, 6 carbons, okay, will be removed from the cholesterol by the mitochondrial enzyme, which is a P450 enzyme. So this is the cholesterol side chain cleavage enzyme. So some of these enzymes are also, again, P450 enzymes. So they are referred to by their gene name. So for example, the cholesterol side chain cleavage enzyme is a P450 enzyme and it's encoded by the gene CYP11A1. And so typically in most references or most of the books, you'll see this name, okay, or this name. So let's go back here. So in the presence of cholesterol side chain cleavage enzyme, the tail 22 to 27, so 6 carbon atoms are removed and a ketone is produced. So what will be produced? So a ketone, which is, okay, there's a ketone there, the pregnenolone. So remember, the conversion of cholesterol to pregnenolone is a rate-limiting step in the steroidogenic pathways. I have mentioned that earlier. And this pregnenolone here can go at certain directions. So let's check first the development of glucocorticoids and aldosterone. So we'll go to the right. Okay? So pregnenolone can be hydroxylated into 17-alpha hydroxypregnenolone. So it could be hydroxylated into 17-alpha hydroxypregnenolone. So from here, it could be hydroxylated. You could see the hydroxyl group here. So notice that at the 17th position of the 5-membrane ring, okay, in this one, so 17th position of the 5-membrane ring, it's going to be hydroxylated by this enzyme, 17-alpha hydroxylase. And it gives us the 17-alpha hydroxypregnenolone. pregnenolone. So that's why it is named as such. So both the pregnenolone, so this one, and the 17-alpha hydroxypregnenolone can form corticosteroids. Okay? So, for example, this enzyme, the 3-beta hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase, can oxidize this hydroxyl group at the 3rd position. So that's why it's named as 3-beta. So it could again, it could oxidize the hydroxyl group at the 3rd position. So it's oxidized, so it's named as 3-beta. So again, the pregnenolone will be oxidized into progesterone, and progesterone will actually be a progestogen or progestin that we can recognize as the functional mammalian hormone. And then the 17-alpha hydroxypregnenolone is going to be oxidized into 17-alpha hydroxyprogesterone. Okay, both again oxidized at what position? At the 3rd position. That's why 3-beta hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase. So I hope you get that one. And in general, this progesterone here can act independently, or the progesterone can be processed into aldosterone. Okay? And then the 17-alpha hydroxyprogesterone here is going to be processed into a cortisol. Okay? Now, the next enzyme in this pathway, okay, regardless of which pathway you're taking, whether progesterone or this hydroxylated version, the enzyme is going to be the 21-hydroxylase. So this one. So the position 21 in the progesterone, so the position 21, okay, I hope you see that one. So the position 21 in the progesterone, as noted by this enzyme, by this one, is going to be hydroxylated by, again, this 21-hydroxylase. So 21-hydroxylase is another P450 enzyme encoded, of course, by CYP21A2. Okay. And another one, progesterone here will be hydroxylated into what? Another hormone. So that's deoxycorticosterone. So it's hydroxylated. So progesterone to deoxycorticosterone by 21-hydroxylase. And then the alpha, or the 17-alpha progesterone or 17-alpha hydroxyprogesterone will be hydroxylated into 11-deoxycortisol. So you can see here the hydroxylation. And both of these enzymes, of course, the 3-beta hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase and the 21-hydroxylase are colored green, right? So they are microsomal enzymes. And then the next enzyme, so the red one, the 11-beta hydroxylase. So hydroxylase. So it will hydroxylate the 11th position in the 6th membrane ring. Okay? So the 11-beta hydroxylase will hydroxylate the deoxycorticosterone, this one, into corticosterone. So where's the 6th position? Okay? So it is hydroxylated. Okay? Next one. And then what will happen here is that the 11-deoxycortisol, so this one, the 11-deoxycortisol will be hydroxylated into cortisol, which is the primary glucocorticoid, of course, or corticosteroid in humans. So again, cortisol is a stress hormone and it can also act independently. And the corticosterone here, this one, can also possess the glucocorticoid activity of cortisol. But this is only considered as the minor corticosteroid hormone in humans. Okay? And then, as what you can see here, the corticosterone, can further be processed into aldosterone, which is involved, of course, in sodium and water retention and potassium excretion. So, by what? Another enzyme. So, corticosterone to aldosterone. So, that is the aldosterone synthase. Remember, this is site specific. In what site of the adrenal cortex? So in zona glomerulosa. So it will hydroxylate. So it will hydroxylate the corticosterone in the 18th position. Okay? That's why this aldosterone synthase, so this enzyme, is sometimes referred to as the CYP18B2. So you can see it here. CYP18B2 because it hydroxylates initially at the 18th position. Okay? So this enzyme can also oxidize the hydroxyl group in an aldehyde. So it can also oxidize the group into an aldehyde, and the aldosterone also gets its name because it's an aldehyde. So aldosterone aldehyde. So this aldosterone synthase enzyme here has generally two activities. So number one, again, as what I've mentioned, hydroxylase activity by the CYP18B2 and the 18-hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase. Okay, that converts the hydroxyl into the aldehyde group. That's why aldehyde, aldosterone. Okay, how about in making the androgens? So, in order to make androgens, two progestogens must be made. The hydroxylated version of pregnenolone and the progesterone. Okay, so two of them, which are the 17-alpha-hydroxypregnenolone, again, this one, and the 17-alpha-hydroxyprogesterone. So the hydroxylated versions of that pregnenolone and progesterone. They should be made first in order to make androgens. So first, this one, the 1720 lyase. So this enzyme actually has the same activity as the 17-alpha hydroxylase. So it also does the activity of 17-alpha hydroxylation. Okay, as what I have mentioned earlier. And sometimes the steroid can be released from the enzyme prematurely, but it's okay because it's going to give us the 17-alpha-hydroxypregnenolone, and the 17-alpha progesterone, this one, which can be processed to aldosterone and cortisol. So that's why I'm telling you it's okay. So if this one, if the 1720 lyase performs its activity on pregnenolone, for example, and progesterone, it will use the hydroxyl group to induce the removal of this ketone. So as what you can see here, there is a ketone. Okay, so the first two androgens, the DHEA, so this one, the dehydroepiandrosterone, and next one, the androstenedione. So the androstenedione. So notice the main difference in the androgens and progestogens. Okay, so these are the progestogens and these are the androgens. So what do you think is the main difference? Okay, so the tail, so this one, the ketone has been completely removed in all androgens and estrogens. So you cannot see a ketone tail there. And that's the characteristic features of these hormones. Okay, these androgens. Okay. So this 3-beta-hydroxy steroid dehydrogenase, okay, can oxidize the 3-beta-hydroxy group into a ketone. So that means it oxidizes DHEA, this one, to androstenedione. Okay? And now, once the DHEA is reduced to androstenediol here, this one, it's already reduced. So, the 3-beta-hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase can oxidize it to testosterone. Okay? So, again, as what I have mentioned, this enzyme, okay, can oxidize the 3-beta-hydroxy group into a ketone. So, that means it can oxidize the DHEA to androstenedione. However, this DHEA can also be reduced to androstenediol. Okay? And the 3-beta-hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase can now reduced it to, can now oxidize it to testosterone, as what you can see here. There's oxidation. So, we see here that two general pathways to produce testosterone, this hormone. So, it reacts with 3-beta hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase, this one, and 17-beta hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase, this one. So, that's for the production of testosterone. But in any case, from these 4 androgens, okay? So from these 4 androgens here, the DHEA, the androstenedione, androstenediol, and testosterone. Take note, among the 4, the testosterone is the most potent androgen. Take note ha, it's among the 4 of them. It's the testosterone, which is the most potent. However, among all of these androgens here, okay, among the 5 of them, the most potent androgen is actually the dihydrotestosterone or dihydrotestosterone. Okay, again, as what I have said, among the 4 of them, the most potent is the testosterone. But among all of them, the most potent is dihydrotestosterone, which is formed, of course, from testosterone. So, testosterone is converted to this most potent androgen, which is the dihydrotestosterone by 5-alpha reductase. Okay, so I hope you take note of that one. So, this 5-alpha reductase here uses the reducing power of NADPH to reduce this to 4-5 double bonds. So, as what you can notice here, the double bond here is removed. So, notice again that in dihydrotestosterone, this one, you can no longer see double bond here. Okay, and a simple removal of that double bond increases the androgenic power of dihydrotestosterone by about 20 to 100-fold. So that's why I'm telling you that it's the very strong or the most potent androgen among all of them. Okay, I hope you get it. And another one, the androstenedione, this one. So the androstenedione and the testosterone here can be processed directly into estrogens by the enzyme aromatase. So in order to make estrogens, so we're here now. So in order to make estrogens, the progestogen must be made first, then the androgens, and finally to estrogens. So notice also that the action of aromatase, okay, here, what you can see is that the aromatase, okay, take a look at the conversion, the action of aromatase to androstenedione. Okay, so this ketone has a net reduction into an alcohol. Okay, you can see here the shaded part. And then the A ring becomes completely aromatic. That's why aromatase looks like this one. So just like that one. So completely aromatic. So that's what I'm telling you. You can see it here. Okay. So one of the defining features of all the estrogens, okay, is what? Okay. One of the defining features of all the estrogens is the aromatic A ring. That's why the enzyme was named as aromatase, because this enzyme aromatizes the A ring. So aromatase will convert androstenedione, okay, to estrone, which is a less active estrogen. And then testosterone can also be aromatized in the same manner, so which produces the primary estrogen, which is the estradiol. So I hope you get that one. And both this estrone and estradiol can be metabolized in the liver and then in the placenta to produce this estriol. So the conversion of this estradiol to estriol is a one-step process. So there is hydroxylation in the corner of the 5-membrane ring, okay, from the D ring, whereas the conversion of the estrone to estriol is a two-step process. So first, the ketone is reduced by the 17-hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase. So this one. And then the hydroxylation at the 6th position catalyzed by another P450 enzymes. Okay, so I hope that this steroidogenesis is clear to you now, and also the different enzymes that are involved in this pathway. Now, let us have the CAH, or the congenital adrenal hyperplasia. So this is an inherited family of enzyme disorders. So we have tackled this one already. So enzyme disorders affecting cortisol, aldosterone, and sex steroid production. And in the table here, you can see the different enzymes affected, the laboratory values, the new classifications of this enzyme defect based, of course, on the gene from which they are produced, the presence of this hypertension, then virilization. So when we say virilization, it's a condition in which a female person develops characteristics associated with male hormones or the androgens, or when a newborn has characteristics of male hormone exposure at birth. So that means when a female develops, for example, hairs in the facial part of the body, or some characteristics associated with male hormones. So that's virilization. So the clinical presentation, okay, of the CAH depends on the affected enzymes, as demonstrated, of course, in this figure. And the partial defects usually present after puberty. And I think I have mentioned this one earlier. The 21-hydroxylase, so it's a hydroxylase family. Again, it's considered as the most clinically important group of enzymes because 95% are a result of 21-hydroxylase deficiency. So that now causes this 17-hydroxyprogesterone, okay, or the hydroxyprogesterone and androgen to be increased. So this will increase, so that's why high lab values, and there is a decreased cortisol because it's adrenal hyperplasia. So the adrenal glands are affected, so the production of cortisol is also affected. And also, in this condition, the treatment of oral glucocorticoids, okay, or other related medications will replace the deficient cortisol and will suppress the ACTH-stimulated androgen excess in order to regulate these values. Okay, so that's for the CAH. Now, let us have the 21-hydroxylase deficiency. So what enzyme is deficient here? Of course, it's 21-hydroxylase. So this is also referred to as the CYP21, CYP21A2, and P450C21. So just remember the number there as based on the parent molecule, which is the cholesterol. And also, this is considered as the most common cause of CAH, or the congenital adrenal hyperplasia. And the second cause is the 11-beta hydroxylase. So hydroxylase. So the 11-beta hydroxylase deficiency. So again, this one, it's the second most common cause of congenital adrenal hyperplasia. So this one, this 11-beta hydroxylase deficiency accounts for about 7% of all cases of CAH. Okay? So this one, this 21-hydroxylase deficiency has two forms, the classic forms and the non-classic forms. Anyway, the screening of newborns using capillary blood, okay, collected from the heel of the newborn on a filter disc has identified this disorder, this 21-hydroxylase deficiency. And remember, in the pathway that we have just tackled, 21-hydroxylase catalyzes the conversion of 17-hydroxyprogesterone, or the 17-OHP, to 11-deoxycortisol, right? So, and also to progesterone to DOC. So that's why the 21-hydroxylase deficiency leads to elevated or increased levels of steroid precursor of this 17-hydroxyprogesterone. Okay, so that's in urine. So you can see elevated or increased 17, okay, hydroxyprogesterone. So that is in urine, and also that is increased in serum. So that's one of the features of the 21-hydroxylase deficiency. And also, for the classic form, it presents in the newborn period or early childhood, as opposed to non-classic, which presents in late childhood or young adulthood. Next, in the classic form, there is adrenal insufficiency. So knowing that the defect is in the steroidogenesis, what type of adrenal insufficiency is this one? Primary, secondary, or tertiary? So this is a type of primary adrenal insufficiency. And also there is virilization. So you know already this one, with or without salt wasting. Okay, how about the non-classic form? So the non-classic form presents again in late childhood or young adulthood. So there is hirsutism. So when we say hirsutism, it's a condition in women, okay, in women that results in excessive growth of dark or coarse hair in a male-like pattern. So in the face, in the chest, and the back. Okay, female persons with hairs in the facial area or in the other parts of the body. Okay, and also in the non-classic form, the presentation in women is very similar to that of PCOS. So you know this one, polycystic ovarian syndrome or the polycystic ovarian disease. So that's in the non-classic form. And in males, however, they can develop precocious puberty, or meaning to say they might have early development of puberty. Also, they could have adrenal rest within the testis and infertility. So that's in male. Now, these pictures show us examples of the patients having 21-hydroxylase deficiency. Remember, if the patient has 21-hydroxylase deficiency, it would cause an elevation in the 17-hydroxyprogesterone, again, both in the serum and the urine. And also, there will be an androgen excess. Okay, so in the left peak here, so in this picture, this is a picture of a female patient with a 46XX karyotype. So it's 46XX karyotype, and there is a mild virilization due to congenital virilizing adrenal hyperplasia. So that's also secondary to 21-hydroxylase deficiency. So this female person lacks 21-hydroxylase. And you can see here a mild clitoromegaly. So that means there is a minimal enlargement of the clitoris, and also this patient has fusion of the labial scrotal folds, and of course, because this is still in the steroidogenic pathway, the patient has salt wasting. How about this one? So this is still a female patient, so there is severe virilization in here, so it's still the same type, 46XX karyotype, with CAH, of course, congenital adrenal hyperplasia, and still secondary to 21-hydroxylase deficiency. And just like this patient also has salt wasting. So why is it that the adrenal glands, I mean the androgens or the reproductive system of these patients are affected? So take note that the defects that decrease the production of cortisol cause increases in the values of ACTH and CRH secretion. Remember the feedback mechanism. So this is in an attempt to stimulate the cortisol levels, right? So if there is decreased cortisol, of course, the ACTH and CRH will be secreted. Okay? And that now will lead to adrenal hyperplasia. Why is it that there will be adrenal hyperplasia? Because there is a continued stimulation from the hypothalamus to produce CRH, and that now results to the excessive production of ACTH to the pituitary gland. So the adrenal gland will be exhausted. So there will be adrenal hyperplasia. So that will lead to overproduction of androgens. Remember, the androgens are produced from the zona reticularis. So that's why you can see these conditions here. But still, it's dependent on the affected enzymes in the steroidogenic pathway. Okay, now this one. So these pictures, okay, this one shows us the hirsutism. Again, it's the excessive growth of dark or coarse hair in a female patient. Okay, it's like a male-like pattern in the face, again in the chest, and also at the back part of the patient. And this one, this is also a female patient. So she's a 12-year-old female patient, and because of the early interruption of treatment, she developed progressive virilization. That's why he has these male features. And also, there is a reduced final height, and also she experiences altered psychosocial orientation, okay, to male. So she really thought he was a male. And one of the reasons, according to this article that I have read, okay, with this patient, so one of the reasons for interrupting replacement therapy in this case was the difficult social and economic status of the family who lived for many years without basic medical care. So these are the results of that 21-hydroxylase deficiency also. So now how about for the diagnosis of 21-hydroxylase deficiency? So this one involves the measurement of 17-hydroxyprogesterone. Take note in what specimen? Okay, in amniotic fluid, because prenatal diagnosis is very important because the suppressive treatment with steroids can avoid the development of virilization, especially in the female fetus. And also, neonatal screening is now mandatory in many states. So it's performed by measuring the 17-hydroxyprogesterone or by genotyping of the blood sample that has been obtained from a heel stick puncture and collected on a filter paper. So for diagnosis, it's not only the measurement of these values but also genotyping cells obtained by chorionic villus sampling, and also again using the blood from a heel stick puncture. So this one, genotyping using this specimen, is the most definitive test for diagnosing CAH. Okay, so the post ACTH and 17-OHP values, so the normal level is 330 nanograms per DL and less. Next one, for the heterozygous carrier, 330 to 1,000 nanograms per DL, and in non-classic CAH is greater than 2,000 nanograms per DL. And the goals of the glucocorticoid and also mineralocorticoid therapy in children, most especially, is the attainment of normal growth, weight, and pubertal development, and also the optimization of final adult height, because just like in the previous picture, there is a stunted growth in that female patient because of this kind of disease. And the major treatment goals in adults, okay, for children, of course, glucocorticoid and mineralocorticoid therapy, okay, in order to attain their normal growth. For adults, on the other hand, it includes the lessening of the signs of virilization and, of course, the resumption of fertility, especially in males. And of course, this mineralocorticoid replacement is done in order to normalize the plasma renin activity. Okay, remember, the aldosterone is also involved here. And on the other hand, the goal of the glucocorticoid replacement is to keep the 17-hydroxyprogesterone, okay, its level to be partially suppressed. So it's between 1,000, so this 17-OHP, so we do the glucocorticoid treatment to suppress the 17-OHP level to 100 to 1,000 nanograms per DL. And also the ACTH, okay, the ACTH value, okay, will be maintained at below 100 nanograms per DL. So that prevents shunting towards the testosterone synthesis, and of course normalizing the levels of androstenedione and also the testosterone. And normalizing this one, okay, should not be attempted. Okay, because this one requires supraphysiologic levels of glucocorticoids and may result in Cushing's syndrome. That's why its level is maintained at these values. So, that's for the reason why that 17 OHP should be maintained at that level in order to avoid, of course, Cushing's syndrome. Now, let us have the congenital lipoid adrenal hyperplasia. So, this one, it's otherwise known as lipoid CAH. So, now you have an idea based on the name what is actually the problem in this one. So, there is this problem in the lipids and in the cholesterol. But anyway, this one, it's the most severe form of CAH because this one, the synthesis of all gonadal and adrenal cortical steroids is markedly impaired. So that means the steroid hormones are decreased. So that is caused maybe because of STAR or the P450 side chain cleavage. So remember this STAR. So this is the one that controls the rate limiting step in steroidogenic pathway, and it's the one that is responsible for the shuttling of cholesterol from the outer to the inner mitochondrial membrane. And this one, anyway, it's located on chromosome 8p11. Okay, and also in this condition, in the lipoid CAH, there is a marked accumulation of cholesterol and other lipids in the adrenal cortex. So this marked accumulation of cholesterol is the primary distinguishing feature from other CAH. And the presentation of this disease is that there is severe adrenal insufficiency, and because there is AI, of course, there will be hypotension, salt wasting, and one of the characteristic features of lipoid CAH is feminization, meaning to say the males have female external genitalia. How about in females? So occasionally, females may not present the symptoms or the signs until the onset of puberty. So based on diagnosis, so for the diagnosis, we can see here that there is extremely low cortisol because what is affected? It's the adrenal gland. And of course, because there is decreased cortisol, there is elevated ACTH. And of course, increased renin activity. So that is for lipoid CAH. Okay, how about this enzyme, the aldosterone synthase? So it's otherwise known as CYP11B2 enzyme, right? Remember, I have mentioned this. This is site-specific. So this aldosterone synthase is the final step in the steroid synthetic pathway or in the steroidogenesis that will lead to the production of what hormone? Of course, the aldosterone. Okay? So, this isolated enzyme deficiency, okay, in the zona glomerulosa will lead to salt wasting. That means the sodium is decreased. Remember, aldosterone reabsorbs sodium. So if there is this aldosterone synthase or synthetase deficiency, then what will happen is aldosterone production will also be impaired. So there will be decreased aldosterone. So nothing now will reabsorb sodium. That's why there is salt wasting. And also, there is hyperkalemia or increased potassium because there is no aldosterone, there is nothing that will excrete the potassium. And because of this hyperkalemia, okay, it will result to metabolic acidosis. Okay, so in an attempt to conserve the potassium or to make it enter into the cell because it's excessive in the plasma. Okay, so that's why there is metabolic acidosis. And also, for the diagnosis, there is elevated DOC, deficiency of this corticosterone, 8-hydroxycorticosterone, or of course, the aldosterone. And of course, in our urine, there is a presence of metabolites of cortisone and 11-deoxycortisone because remember, this aldosterone synthetase or CYP11B2 stimulates a multi-step process. So 11 hydroxylation of DOC to corticosterone, and then 18 hydroxylation of corticosterone to 18 hydroxycorticosterone, and finally 18 dehydrogenation to aldosterone. So just go back to the pathway that I have discussed earlier. Now let us have the Cushing's syndrome. So this one, it was described by Harvey Cushing in the 1930s. So take note, we also have the Cushing's disease. So how do we differentiate it from the Cushing's syndrome? So in Cushing's disease, there is increased cortisol. So it's also seen in Cushing's syndrome. So both of them have increased cortisol level. However, the Cushing's disease is caused by excessive development and activity of pituitary gland, meaning to say there is hyperplasia of the pituitary gland. So that's with the Cushing's disease. So that now would result, of course, to increase ACTH, right? Because it's the pituitary gland that releases this ACTH. So that's why we can see cortisol level that is also increased. So that's for the Cushing's disease. And also a pituitary tumor may develop that will stimulate increased production of this ACTH. So that's for the Cushing's syndrome. But you have to take note that in both instances, the primary site of disruption is the pituitary gland, either because of hyperplasia or tumor. So what will happen is there will be an increase in the steroid production and excretion, and also increased ACTH values. So these are the signs and symptoms of patients with Cushing's syndrome. So there will be hypertension because of the action of cortisol in increasing the blood pressure. Also, there will be osteoporosis, immune suppression, wherein the phospholipase A2, interleukin 2, and histamine are all suppressed. Next one, there will be muscle weakness with thin extremities. This is because the cortisol will break down the muscles for amino acids to be used in gluconeogenesis. Also, the patient will exhibit moon face, buffalo humps, and truncal obesity. So this is a moon face feature of the patient having Cushing's syndrome, and these are the buffalo humps. Okay, that occurs because of high insulin due to high glucose. Remember, the cortisol is high. So the cortisol is high. So what will happen is it will lead to high glucose. So next one, because there is increased glucose, insulin production will also be increased. So because the glucose is used up also, then there will be an increased fat storage. So that now will lead to moon-faced and buffalo humps. And also, there will be abdominal striae. So that's due to impaired collagen synthesis. So there's thinning of skin. So this one, this shows us the pictures of patients with buffalo humps because of Cushing's syndrome. So they are the same patient. Okay, so this one now develops this moon face feature. And also this one, there is this abdominal striae, and also the patient could develop this periorbital edema. Okay, also this one, this is the abdominal striae, and this is the different complications of the Cushing's syndrome. Okay, so what are the causes of Cushing's syndrome? So we have 4. So first one, we have the exogenous steroids. So remember, these steroids act like a cortisol. So if a patient is given steroids, it follows that this steroid will pretend that it's the cortisol. So the body will take it as there is an increased cortisol. So since the steroid is increased, acting like a cortisol, it will now send a negative feedback to the pituitary, meaning to say the pituitary gland, okay? So the pituitary gland will not produce ACTH because again, the cortisol is already increased. But actually, it's not the cortisol that is a problem. It's the steroids acting like a cortisol. And because there is a negative feedback to the pituitary gland, so meaning to say there is a lack of stimulation from this pituitary gland leading to a decreased ACTH production, the adrenal glands will atrophy. And it's a type of bilateral adrenal atrophy. Bilateral because both of the adrenal glands are affected. And again, what's the cause? Because of decreased ACTH. How about this one? Primary adrenal adenoma. Take note. There is adenoma in the adrenal gland. So, in this one of the adrenal glands has adenoma. Okay? Only one of the adrenal glands. That's why it's unilateral. So, this adenoma will secrete a lot of cortisol. So, just like in number 1, the cortisol is still increased. So, what's the cause of that one? The adenoma secreting an increased level of cortisol. So, now, the cortisol will negative feedback the hypothalamus to stop the production of CRH. So, once there is no CRH production, the pituitary gland will also not produce ACTH. So, still, the ACTH is decreased in this condition. Okay, so take note, only one of the adrenal gland is affected, or only one of the adrenal gland has adenoma. So usually, the normal adrenal gland, the one without the adenoma, will be the one that will atrophy. And the one with adenoma will undergo hyperplasia. That's why it's called unilateral adrenal atrophy. Okay, how about this one? Number 3, ACTH secreting pituitary adenoma. Now, the adenoma is located in the pituitary gland, and this adenoma or this tumor is secreting ACTH. So, the pituitary gland itself has adenoma. It secretes a lot of ACTH. So, the pituitary gland is secreting a lot of ACTH. So, this is increased. So, that will lead now to continued stimulation of the adrenal glands to produce elevated levels of cortisol. So, that's why in this case, the cortisol is elevated. And the adrenal glands will undergo hyperplasia because of the continued increase in ACTH. And the negative feedback is not occurring because the pituitary gland itself has tumor. So that's why there is hyperplasia, there is increased ACTH, and the condition is bilateral because both the adrenal glands are affected. How about this one? Paraneoplastic ACTH secretion. So this one, paraneoplastic, this is usually caused by small carcinoma of the lungs. So as what you can see here, there is bilateral hyperplasia also because of ACTH production. So the tumor in the lungs, so this one, so the tumor in the lungs secretes a lot of ACTH, leading to elevated cortisol production from both the adrenal glands. So that's why there is bilateral hyperplasia. Okay, so that's for the causes of the Cushing's syndrome. So in the clinical setting, in order to differentiate this ACTH secreting pituitary adenoma to paraneoplastic ACTH secretion, a high dose of dexamethasone is given to the patient. So anyway, just remember that this dexamethasone is an exogenous steroid. So that provides now a negative feedback to the pituitary gland to suppress the secretion of ACTH. So that means it decreases the ACTH levels. So based on what I have said, which of the two conditions, this one and this one, will be suppressed by this dexamethasone? Okay, so it's the ACTH secreting pituitary adenoma that will be suppressed by dexamethasone. Remember, this is an exogenous steroid, meaning to say it acts like a cortisol. Remember, in the ACTH secreting pituitary adenoma, the pituitary gland itself has adenoma, and that adenoma secretes a lot of ACTH, right? And that increased ACTH will also increase the cortisol. So that's what we can see in ACTH secreting pituitary adenoma. So increased ACTH leading to increased cortisol. But if we give the patient a dexamethasone, it's as if the patient has already an increased cortisol level. So that now, that increased cortisol level because of this dexamethasone will send a negative feedback to the pituitary gland to decrease the ACTH production. That's why this pituitary adenoma, okay, it will result to the suppression, okay? Suppression of what? Suppression of ACTH value, or the suppression of the pituitary gland in producing this ACTH. How about this one? It's paraneoplastic ACTH secretion. So where is the problem? The problem is in the lung. So this dexamethasone again acts on the pituitary gland. So this one will not be suppressed by dexamethasone. Now let's have this Addison's disease. So this one was first described by Thomas Edison in 1855. So this is a disorder characterized by a decrease in the production of cortisol or other steroids. Take note that in Addison's disease, the adrenal glands are underactive. So that will result to a deficiency of adrenal hormones. So it's not only the cortisol that is decreased, but also it leads to a decrease in the mineralocorticoid. So that means the aldosterone is also decreased here in Addison's disease. So when the adrenal glands become underactive, as what I have said, they tend to produce inadequate amounts of all of the adrenal hormones. So that includes the corticosteroid, particularly this cortisol, and mineralocorticoids, this aldosterone, which of course this steroid controls the blood pressure and also the salt and the potassium level in the body. And the adrenal glands also stimulate the production of small amounts of testosterone and estrogen, right? And other similar sex hormones. So that's why if the adrenal glands are underactive, those hormones are also affected. And this Addison's disease may be due to, number one, a defect in the synthesis of hormones in the adrenal glands, or maybe because of low ACTH production due to the damage to the hypothalamus or pituitary. So I think I have mentioned this earlier that the aldosterone also respond to the stimulation of ACTH. But remember, the main regulation of aldosterone is in the RAAS. That's why it is specified here, the cortisol. Now let us differentiate the primary and secondary Addison's disease. So just take note that in the primary Addison's disease, the problem is in the adrenal glands, whereas in the secondary Addison's disease, the problem is in the pituitary gland. So as what I have mentioned, in Addison's disease, the adrenal glands are usually underactive. So that results to a decreased adrenal hormones, particularly the hormones of the adrenal cortex. So in the primary Addison's disease, the problem here is in the adrenal cortex. So meaning to say, there is a decreased cortisol and to a lesser extent, a decreased aldosterone. So remember that aldosterone also responds to ACTH secretion, right? So in this condition, we can see a high ACTH level. So remember, this decrease in cortisol particularly and also a decrease in aldosterone will stimulate the pituitary gland to produce what? To produce ACTH. That's why the ACTH is increased. And because this melanocyte-stimulating hormone is also produced in the pituitary gland, so this one will be also increased. So that speaks of the hyperpigmentation seen in primary Addison's disease. And also because there is a decreased aldosterone here, the reabsorption of sodium and also the excretion of potassium is affected. So we can see high potassium and high hydrogen ions and also metabolic acidosis. And of course, because there is a decrease in cortisol, then we can see a decreased blood glucose level. And as opposed to that, we have the secondary Addison's disease, wherein the problem lies in the pituitary gland, meaning to say, despite the low levels of these hormones, the pituitary gland are not, the pituitary gland, is not stimulated to produce ACTH. That's why you can see these values and also other things here. So these are the signs and symptoms of the patients having Addison's disease. So remember, the adrenal glands are affected because they are underactive. So meaning to say, all the hormones produced by these adrenal glands are affected, not only the cortisol, so also the aldosterone and also the androgens are affected. So also the MSH production by pituitary gland is affected. That's why there is bronze pigmentation of skin because of increased MSH, and also changes in the distribution of body hair because also the androgens are affected. GI disturbances, weakness, hypoglycemia, postural hypotension, and weight loss. So there is also adrenal crisis. So there is profound fatigue, dehydration, vascular collapse, or decreased blood pressure, renal shutdown. So again, this one, serum sodium is decreased and potassium is increased. It goes back to the function of aldosterone. So how about this one? Primary aldosteronism. So this is what we call as the Conn's syndrome. So this one occurs when there is a small tumor of the zona glomerulosa cells. So zona glomerulosa. So what is the main mineralocorticoid affected when this one has a condition that affects its production of the cells? So the main mineralocorticoid affected is the aldosterone. However, in a few instances, hyperplastic adrenal cortices also secrete aldosterone rather than cortisol. So in this case, there will be a decreased potassium because aldosterone again excretes potassium. So if there is an increased amount of aldosterone, then what will happen is there will also be increased excretion of potassium. And because there is an increased reabsorption of sodium, so also we can see an increased extracellular fluid volume and blood volume. That's because of the reabsorption of sodium and also water. Okay? Next one, there is a very slight increase in plasma sodium concentration. However, it's not more than 4 to 6 MEq per liter. And also, there is hypertension. So that ends my discussion. I hope you learned something. So thank you so much for listening.